If I can call us to order, ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin by acknowledging that we are on Treaty 1 land and that we are on the homeland of the Métis people, and we give thanks for the privilege of living on these lands and living with the resources. And in some ways, it's kind of ironic to start off this class with that particular acknowledgement, because we're going to talk today about probably the worst piece of racist history in Canada. You'll be very proud to know, and I'll tell you this up front, that the material we're dealing today, the South African government sent a delegation to Canada in the 1920s to look at how well Canada had handled the First Nations through the Indian Act, and they copied it, and it is a model for the Bantu Stamp in South Africa. So we can be very proud of that particular connection. So today we want to talk about the Indian Act, and I gave you in the reading package excerpts from the 1876 version. Vince is going to take this over, and I'm going to let him run with it, but the excerpts from the 1876 version. The 1876 Indian Act is actually a compilation of a series of pre-Confederation pieces of legislation, such wonderful pieces of legislation as the Gradual Civilization Act of 1859. So it's the bringing together of a whole collection of acts from an earlier period. The other thing that we should note before we actually get into the Indian Act is that Section 9124, and by the way, I don't know the Constitution that well, I happen to know that section. Section 9124 of the Canadian BNA Act, the Constitution Act of 1867, as they now say, designates responsibility for Indians and lands assigned to Indians to the federal government. So it's in that document that the responsibility for First Nations is assigned to the federal government, and that's where and how it sits. Okay, and that remains the case today. So you have to sort of have that in the back of your head at all times, that First Nations are solely a federal responsibility. The problem is that, as I said to you last week, that the federal government, in order for the federal government to do anything, it needs legislation that tells the government what to do. And so the Indian Act is the legislation that tells the federal government what to do. Okay? And that is indeed part of the problem. The other quick thing to note before we really get started on it is that the Indian Act has had three major forms. All right. Well, swap places here. Okay, there we go. The Indian Act has had three major forms. The form which you saw, which is in 1876. And then that excerpt I gave you also gives you some of the major and most oppressive revisions to the Indian Act. Because the Indian Act is federal legislation, the federal government is continually tinkering with it, all the time. It does it every session. They tinker with something in the Indian Act. It's almost a habit for the federal government. The next major revision is 1951. So it comes into effect in 1876. The next major revision is 1951, and the 1951 revision takes off some of the most oppressive pieces. It doesn't change the nature of the act, which is what Vince is going to really go after, but it does take off some of those most oppressive pieces. And then there's a further major revision in 1985. And 1985 is the revision that changes the rules around who is and who's not an Indian. Okay? And so those are the three major revisions that have taken, major forms that the Act has taken over time. But in between, it gets tinkered with all the time. And in case I brought it. I do have it. In case anybody wants to see well, this is not quite current because this is printed in 2002, but the current version of the Act, that's after the 1985 revision. I also carry around with me, for very bad historic reasons, before 1985 version of the Indian Act. So if anybody wants to see those, you can actually see all the pieces in it. So that's the history of the Act. We should also note that this is the only Act on the books in any Western country. We could use the word Western civilized country, yeah, there we go. In any Western country that is specifically directed towards a particular ethnic or racial group. All right? So it's the only act in any Western legislature that's specifically directed towards a particular, depends on how you define, and that's what we're about to do, a particular ethnic group. The other thing I'll note right up front, it's not in the 1876 version, but it is in the later versions after 1939, that the Indian Act, Section 3 of the Indian Act, specifically said this act does not apply to people commonly known as Inuit. So Inuit do not come under the Indian Act, okay? And that was due to a very convoluted decision in 1939, which said that Inuit are the responsibility of the federal government, but they do not come under the Indian Act. So all this stuff does not apply to the Inuit. And of course, it also does not apply to Métis. It just applies to First Nations. So do you want to take it from there?
Sure.
Yeah.
I have a really strange comfort, actually, in knowing that someone is responsible for me.
So, is that your wife?
No, that would be the government.
Oh.
My wife doesn't particularly want that responsibility. She just says, "Get out and go to work." Anyway, so yeah, so it was and is and continues to be and will likely continue to be until it's somehow gotten rid of, a very racist, basically is what it is, a racist act. And the very first Indian Act of 1876 actually says a person means an individual other than an Indian. So that's in section 12 of the Indian Act. And it really spells out, actually, just exactly the kind of relationship that Indigenous people are going to have with the federal government. And but then it goes on and on and on and on about all of these other things that were very much a part of and were added to the Indian Act as time went by up until the 1950s. And even into the 1960s, things started to change a bit. Part of what the Indian Act did was that it denied status of individuals who they didn't want or deemed not to be Indigenous, right? So they denied status to people who were educated. So for me, if that piece of legislation was still in place, because I'm educated and because I am a clergy, I wouldn't be considered an Indian. And so, but I would have all the rights of Canadian citizenship, but I just stopped being Native. And the other thing that
nation can do.
It also applies to lawyers and doctors.
yes.
Are you a person then?
He becomes a person.
You become a person then.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And yeah, so I would become a person. I'm not quite sure if ordination makes you a person.
Makes you a parsonage.
You can ask Andrew that tomorrow night.
I'll let you know.
Something will happen when a bishop zaps you with this. But the other thing that it did was that it actually renamed individuals from their indigenous names to European names. And so a lot of people who have had Indian names became something else. And so you would see these chiefs who put their X's on the marks. The next thing that would happen is that they would become Joe Smith or whatever. Right? They forbade First Nations from forming political organizations. So, so the NDP party wouldn't have been there at the time, because that would be the only political organization we would have formed. And nobody laughs at that. I say that all the time, but nobody
You have
laughs.
too many NDPers around, I'm sure.
So that was one of the major things was that, so there would not have been what we have today, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, the Assembly of First Nations, but it wasn't even until 1969, really 1970, that these organizations started to appear all across Canada. The other thing that it did was that it prohibited anyone, First Nations or non-First Nations, from soliciting funds for legal claims without special permission or license from the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. So this was in 1977, was amended to have control over the ability of First Nations to pursue land claims, is what that was for. You had a lot of people who, at that time, were actually just amazing individuals who wanted and saw that a lot of what was going on in First Nation reserves, as well as in the residential school, who wrote to the federal government and said, this isn't right, right? And some of the people were lawyers that had wanted to somehow help these First Nations people to go to the Indian Affairs or sue them for what was going on. But because the federal government didn't want that, they made it specific in the Indian Act that lawyers were not allowed to do that, or anybody for that matter, across Canada. And so they made it into law through the Indian Act that nobody could do that. So it gave the federal government control to be able to say to someone, you know, too bad, right? And if you try and help this one, especially if you're a lawyer at that time, if you try and help Indigenous people to sue the federal government, your license was pulled, right? And it was just taken away from you. And so not a lot of people were suing the federal government because of this, right? And we'll talk about Dr. Bryson after a while, in how he tried to help Indigenous people and what happened to him. The other thing that they prohibited was the sale of alcohol to First Nations people. This set up quite, I think, personally, the problems that First Nations have towards alcohol today. Although this part of the Indian Act was agreed upon by the chiefs within the various First Nations, and so they said, okay, we don't want alcohol in our community anyway, so just forget about that and just prohibit that for there to happen. I was reading this book. It's called Firewater, and it's a really good book if you want to read it. It's quite controversial, but one of the things the author says was that, and I think I tend to agree with him, that a lot of First Nations people, because alcohol was prohibited in First Nations, and that the fact that the Indian agents were there, and in close proximity to the Indian agents were the RCMP, that whenever you drank alcohol, you drank it. You would sit there, and you would drink it and drink it and drink it until it's all gone. Because if you did, you would be thrown in jail, fined, or you would be, taken away. And so I think it became, or he as well argues that it became a bit of a habitual way of drinking. So in the times when I used to drink, I think that that would be true. It also prohibited sale of ammunition to First Nations. You can buy a gun, but without the ammunition, what would you do with it, right? At first, and but I think the federal government finally realized that these Native people needed to hunt, and it probably would be good to give them some kind of thing to help them with that, right? Even though I think First Nations people have always done that and knew how to do that way before the gun came into place. You were prohibited to go into a pool hall. I don't know quite sure why a pool hall, do you?
Probably because of the alcohol and the bad company you'd be keeping there.
Trouble.
Trouble.
People like Paul Latin. And it caused probably the gambling too.
Okay. And they wouldn't, pool hall owners were actually forbidden from allowing First Nations people to go into their establishment. They imposed a band council system, which basically undermined the council systems that were in place at the time. In Norway House, it was a matriarchy society, and so it was the women who told the men what to say, what to do, that kind of stuff. It was the men who were the politicians. However, though, it was the women who controlled the politicians. And so that kind of my thought at the time of that women were secondary to the men were very much imposed upon First Nations people at the time. And it undermined the standing that First Nations women had within their communities, even within their families and elsewhere. And so they imposed this band council system where there was a chief and about 2 councillors who were voted on, not by everyone in the community, but by the men. Right? So there, alongside the chief and council sometimes, there was already someone, a headman, who may not be, or could be the same one, who may not be the chief that was elected for the band council thing, right? So sometimes what happened was, the one chief who was elected to be the band council chief would sign all the papers, right? But the meetings that happened would happen somewhere else. So in Norway House there was a chief and council, but there was another chief. This chief over here was the one that made the decisions, along with the men and the women. This one, the band council person, was the one that signed the papers to go to the federal government. Right? And so sometimes these people would have a say in what was going on here. Sometimes they wouldn't, depending on how close the Indian agent was. And if the Indian agent happened to live on the First Nations, then he had total power over what would happen. It was forbidden to speak your native language. That was another thing that was part of the Indian Act, the very beginning one. Native people were not allowed to do that. Not quite sure how that was imposed, personally.
Vincent?
Yeah.
But I was with the Anglican Healing Fund, we were supporting a group in Vancouver Island to regain their language. They had very few speakers left in the community, and those elderly people were afraid that they would go to jail if they spoke their language. So it must have been important somehow.
they forbade First Nations from practicing traditional spirituality. My grandfather, I think I said this before, went to residential school in Norway House, and where the Indian agent was, you know about who the Indian agent was? You know. The Indian agent was basically the law on the reserve. He was the policeman, the judge. He was the one who said yes or no. He was the one that signed papers whether of things you could and could not do. And he was the one that actually just sends you off to jail and could have you arrested at any time. He was the one that imposed or made sure that the Indian Act was followed within the communities. And so in Norway House, when my grandfather was in a residential school, the residential school was in the northern part of the reserve, and the further south you went, the more traditional it became. And so my grandfather moved from there all the way down to what we call Mission Island, which is where the Anglican mission was, but didn't have a residential school. And there you could actually learn our traditions and our ceremonies. And so he learned those there. But if he had the people up north, up on where the residential school was called Rossville, and those people were considered to be Christian Indians because they didn't have any of this other traditions, and they all were Christians. So they thought, anyway. And
You're Methodist.
well, yes.
Take that as a compliment.
Yes. So a lot of the traditional practices were actually forbidden everywhere. And the Stony Mountain penitentiary was actually built to house these native people who broke the laws of the Indian Act. Right? And so if elders were taken away, because they'd been caught practicing or teaching traditions, they would be taken and placed at Stony Mountain Penitentiary. Also, if anyone broke the law of the land, they would be taken there too. But all of these things, all the prohibitions within the Indian Act apply, and you could be jailed for them. First Nations men and women, parents who refused to send their kids to residential schools and repeatedly did this were jailed, were taken away by the federal government, sent off to a prison because they refused to have their kids go to a school or someplace which they didn't want to happen. So the appearing of public dancing in your regalia, none of that is supposed to be happening. Exhibitions, stampedes. I think the stampede was very much just Calgary.
It created a huge problem with the Calgary stampede.
Yeah.
That's why it has a stampede village and still does.
Yeah. So you couldn't do any of those things. First Nations were denied the right to vote. When was that? When was the vote given to women? Anyone know?
In the 1920s.
1919?
I think it was 1927.
First Nations people didn't get the vote until 1959, 1960. And so we were still considered to be non-citizens until 1960. So my grandfather, for most of his life, because my grandfather was born in 1903, most of his life was a non-Canadian. So was my dad. And it was only so I was born in 1964. So 4 years earlier, if I was born then, at that time, I wouldn't have been a citizen at all. Right? And so citizens really
Well,
don't have that
the
many.
great irony was that at that time Indian Affairs was in the Department of Citizenship and Immigration. It moved up later,
Yeah,
but at that time it was in the Department of Citizenship and Immigration.
yeah.
You know, the First Nations are a bunch of immigrants.
That's right, yeah. Everything from Russia or in that area, I think, yeah. In some other places.
They were given the vote and it was taken away, right?
They were given the vote at the very beginning before the Indian Act, during the Enfranchisement Act, but then as soon as the Indian Act came about,
They took it away.
they took it away.
The Indian Act makes First Nations wards of the government. So wards in the same way that children are wards. That's the best way to think about it. So that's why, because of that equation, they didn't have a vote.
It was interesting, there was this, when I was working at the school division, I used to invite elders to come and speak to kids, and so part of what they would teach was things like the Indian Act and how it had affected them. And he says, one night I went to bed, I was not a Canadian. The next morning I woke up and I was. And nobody bothered to ask me if I wanted to be one. Right? And it was very, very much like that, right? If you, the federal government could tell you 1 minute that you are not a Canadian citizen, and then the next minute would say, yes, you are now, right? Without consultation, without even asking whether or not this is something that you wanted. And so, which was basically the way the Indian Act was done, that this is it, right.
The other irony on that is that the Inuit were declared to be Canadian citizens in 1890. And that's because we needed Canadian citizens to occupy the Arctic Islands to show that we actually occupied the Arctic Islands. So if you declare all of the Inuit Canadians, we therefore occupy the islands. So the Inuit have always been Canadians. Not always, but as long as Canada.
But they still had to wear identification
Well, that
tags, though, right?
was to prove they were Canadian.
Okay. Wow. Even including the numbers that they were? Because they were numbered, right?
Yes. To answer your question about women, Manitoba was the first 1916.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but you see, like, women weren't persons until then. That's, of course, a famous
They were
fight.
persons after that, actually.
They were persons after
It was
that.
1920s.
And so First Nations were not persons in the same way that women were not persons.
So really it was a piece of legislation that its sole purpose really was to subjugate one race of people. I hate using that word race because it's not really, I don't really believe that there is such a thing as race, but to subjugate Indigenous peoples. There was, cases, the Indian Reserve that was made. I wish I had a blackboard that I could use, but well,
I do have a pen. You can write on these things, although you can't get it now.
it's okay.
Here, I have a pen. Well, you get it one. Can you get it in here? Okay, Winston, if you pull that out.
Is it plugged in?
Right in front of the bishop and Heather.
I'll show you, I'll flip it over. That's right. So part of the reserve system, let's take Norrie House as an example. Norrie House has, the piece of land is very much like that. It comes down all the way down here, gets cut off this way, and then it's very much like that, right? The Red River, the Nelson River is there. And then there's another one called Jack River, which meets the Nelson River. And So this would be the territory that was ceded by the First Nations people of Norway House, right? So according to the Indian Act, according to treaty that is, not the Indian, according to treaty, Indigenous people, the native people who lived on Norway House or who signed this, could move around anywhere in this territory and in this land. What the Indian Act did was that it created the reserve system so that a little tiny piece of it became what is known as the community or the reserve. So the Indian agent will be situated within that reserve. If you wanted to go hunting, you would need permission in order for you to leave and go out into the other parts of the territory, even though treaty said that you could, right? But you needed that permission, and if you did not have that permission, if you were caught over here without it, then you could be fined. The other thing that happens was it kept non-Indigenous people away from the reserves. And so a non-Indigenous person could be fined $50 if they trespassed. I guess at that time, $50 was quite a bit of change, right? And you could be fined if you were to go into the native reserve. So not only did it promote Indigenous people being segregated into their own place in the area, but it also didn't promote non-Indigenous people from getting to know First Nations people as well, because that was very much forbidden. And it was something that just was not breaking.
That's the furniture.
Yes.
Brand new.
That's it. I'll pay for it. UIND has lots of money. As the bishop chokes on his and so that was what was going on with that.
But I think you have to see this as one of the great contradictions of the Indian Act, in that the Indian Act is basically a policy of assimilation. It's to force First Nations to become part of larger white society. But as Vince just pointed out, the way you make people become part of the larger white society is by segregating them and isolating them off and not allowing anybody else to interact with them. So this is one of the fundamental contradictions in the Act that they didn't seem to realize until about 110 years too late.
Yeah, so you could be fined, or you could go to jail for 1 month, or both. And the reason, of course, why the Indian Act happened and why the treaties happened was because Sir John A. McDonald wanted the Canadian lands and the Canadian prairies specifically. It's interesting at the mindset that he had. It said, we acquired the Northwest Country in 1870. Not a life was lost. Well, you can debate that.
First Nations people.
That's right. Not a blow was struck. Well, there was a lot of blows, I believe. Not a pound nor a dollar was spent in warfare. Well, yes, there was. In that long period that has since intervened, I have not hesitated to tell this House again and again that we could not always hope to maintain peace with the Indians, okay? That the savage was still a savage, and that until he ceased to be savage, we were always in danger of a collision, in danger of war, in danger of an outbreak. I am only surprised that we have been able so long to maintain peace. So he needed to continue the treaty-making process, but he also needed to continue and have a way of making sure that the Indian Act continued. And he said this in 1870. So 3 years after, before the Indian Act started.
So he was saying he couldn't trust the signers of the treaty.
That's right. The other thing that the Indian Act did was that it created a permit system. So you, like I just said recently, you needed to have a permit in order for you to leave your reserve. But the other thing that it did was that you needed a permit in order for you to sell your produce, right? So let's take, for example, a First Nations that is in Manitoba, and which is the Roseau River. What happened there was the Native people signed Treaty Number 1, and so they then started to farm, which is basically what the government wanted them to do. They wanted to, so they started to farm, and they were really, really successful at it. They were actually excellent. They were really good. But then, surrounding Roseau, right, were all of these non-Indigenous settlements, and the majority of whom were Mennonites, who were farmers, and these are my wife's people that we're talking about. I don't know if we want that on tape or not, because she listens to these things. And but they started to get upset because these people were so good in the work that they were doing that they complained to the federal government, right? And who would you listen to? A citizen who would vote for you, right? Who would pay taxes, or someone who is, like Chris said, a ward of the state. And so the federal government then decided that they would write into the Indian Act that Native people could not sell.
Oh, you want me to read it since
Yeah.
I've got my glasses on and you don't? It says, a transaction of any kind whereby a band or a member thereof purports to sell, barter, exchange, give, or otherwise dispose of cattle or other animals, grain or hay, whether wild or cultivated, or root crops or plants, or their products from a reserve in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or Alberta, to a person other than a member of the band, is void unless it's approved by the superintendent.
Yes. So you needed permission.
And by the way, that's the 2002 version.
Is that in like in this?
No, it's not in that version, it's later.
So this comes later.
Yeah, it comes in the 1880s, it's actually added in.
You can actually get the permit to sell, if that's what it's called, online, and they have all kinds of.
But it's still in force, that's the
Yeah.
point.
Excuse me, Chris, when did it come into effect?
In the 1880s.
1880s.
And so you couldn't sell anything to your farm as well, but the other thing that you couldn't do was you couldn't sell it in the reserve, right? You could give it away, or the family could use it, but you certainly couldn't make a profit or anything out of the produce that you had. So the other thing that they did then, Rosa, was that they had some land of timber that they could sell to the settlers who came, and so they were wanting to do that. A lot of their a lot of the logs that came through the Roseau River anyway, right? So they floated these logs down up into the Red River and into Winnipeg. And they thought, well, why would they need to do that if we can give them or provide them with that, since we're not allowed to sell our produce and our and our animals, let's do that. So they did. Until these people who owned the sawmills and provided the lumber to the settlers wrote to the federal government and said, this is unfair competition. And so what happened? Well, it was shut down. So you could not take anything out of the earth. And without permission at all, you could not distribute it or sell it within the boundaries of the reserve, without permission.
Is this the section of the act that dealt with, several years ago, a quarry that was trying to sell stone for a road, and to this day, there's just a big pile of stone?
It's actually a different section, but it's the same thing, same principle.
Yeah, there is actually, it's on highway number 6. They were, I think it was Roseville too, wasn't it?
Not on highway 6.
No, but I think they were the ones that wanted to sell.
Yeah, it could have been.
Or maybe it was Fairford.
Yeah, more likely Fairford.
I think it was Fairford.
There.
Yeah, so what happened was they actually bought the machine that makes stone or rock into gravel, right? And they were going to sell this rock to the provincial government for them to use in upgrading, fixing up highway number 6, which goes from the perimeter all the way north to Thompson, and I think a little bit further. But because they did not get permission from the federal government in order for them to do that, they could not sell it. And the provincial government could not buy it because it was prohibited, right? And so it sat there for many, many, many years, waiting for something to happen. Every time I would drive up home, I would see the big pile of stuff there, and I'm going, it was just a useless, senseless thing.
What year are you talking about?
This was up until, that's 5 years, 6 years ago, it was still there. And it started in the 1990s,
Really?
late 1990s, yeah.
I often refer to this as a deliberate policy of underdevelopment, because you find this, and this goes way back in history, and we could give examples all across Canada, where First Nations develop a resource, or have access to and sell a resource, and actually quite often make some good money at it and do quite well at it. And it's pretty much as soon as that happens, it gets shut down and banned. And you find that consistently across Canada with whatever resources. So for example, the fishery on Lake Winnipeg, the entire fishery on Lake Winnipeg was controlled by Peguis First Nation until the government sold all the fishing licenses to the Icelanders and prohibited the First Nations. So the First Nations became crew on the Icelander boats, but they could no longer fish. The Rainy River sturgeon fishery, same thing. These kind of examples that Vince was talking about with quarries. There's actually a case that goes back to 1857, which is identical to this, where actually the CPR quarry gravel out of an Indian reserve. Actually, it's actually a great case, because the First Nation in that case hired a surveyor to come and find out how much the CPR had taken. They measured it, and then the First Nation simply sent a bill to the CPR for the amount of gravel that they'd taken. And the CPR went and complained to the Indian Department that these Indians had no right to bill them for it, which led to a 5-year battle, and in the end they did get paid for it, but they got paid less than a quarter of the value. And then, of course, legal costs. But so in my mind, I would call this a deliberate policy of underdevelopment. And so as we think in the modern age about the poverty, and I won't use the same language that I use in my classes, but if you're a First Nations person sitting in one of these contexts where you develop a resource and then it gets prohibited that you're no longer allowed to sell it, your attitude is, well, why bother? Why should I even bother to try? And so it sort of feeds into all of these attitudes and stereotypes we find. But it has been a systematic and deliberate policy since the 1850s that basically every time First Nations develop a resource, that it gets taken away.
And what impact, roughly, I realize this is probably a very broad subject, but what impact will that policy have on things like urban reserves, Capion barracks?
God only knows. We don't know yet. Because it's I don't know, the policy might have changed. I'm not as optimistic as some people are. But look how long it's taken them to get Cap Young. Yeah.
Well, you could only, I mean, even, you can sell to anyone. So if you go to the First Nation Urban Reserve in Headingley, you can sell, they can sell to anyone, right? And so I,
Yeah, they must be changing some of these
Yeah.
rules.
I think for urban reserves it might be different,
Okay.
right?
Certainly the cigarettes in Montreal were cheap.
Yeah.
They're also cheaper here.
We're not going down that road.
Is oil and gas in Alberta under those restrictions as well?
Well, the
Reserves.
only reserve that's affected by oil and gas is Havima.
And do they sell it?
Yeah.
Well, that's when you get into tricky lease arrangements
Yes.
that are quite peculiar.
So to this day, I know two people actually who, I think I've said this before, take the dirt from their home reserve, right? Brought it home in a jar, glass jar, and put it on their on their cupboard or somewhere prominent, so that if the federal government ever wanted to, they could come and arrest them for taking a piece of the reserve land off reserve. Because you're not even allowed to take the dirt off the Indian
You
reserve
put dirt on your reserve?
away.
You must have a rich
Oh, we have
reserve.
lots of dirt.
Vince, can I just ask a question back a little ways there? When you were talking about people on the reserve, members of the band, selling like produce or something like that, did you say that I got it that they couldn't sell off reserve, but they can't even sell it within the reserve?
Well, we
Or
can,
at that time?
well, still today, my father was a fisherman, and he was not allowed, he could sell it to the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation, but he was not allowed to sell it to anybody else on reserve. So it is still very much, this is still very, very much like that. And the other thing that had happened was, in terms of produce and part of the land, minerals specifically, if at Kobima, for example, they would find the oil, right? But that oil, that money that was generated from that oil would not go to the native people there. What happened to that money was that it would be put on trust fund, right? It's still very much that way, that that it would be put into a trust fund that would be held by the federal government, and it would be administered by the federal government, right? And so if the native people or the band needed that money for something, they would still have to ask for their own money. There is, in all across Canada, there have been trust funds that have been set up by the federal government, and it's all sitting in one big pile in Ottawa somewhere, I'm not sure. But apparently, there are trillions of dollars in those trust funds. And there was one of the bands had taken the federal government to court to say, to give us those trust funds, right? But the federal government hasn't and won't, because that would bankrupt them. So, yeah, so whenever I hear someone say, all of this money is coming out of our taxes, we're funding the Indigenous people. No, you're not. They're not, right? The federal government is taking money from those trust funds and using it not only to fund Indian affairs and Indigenous people, but also to fund all of the other social programs that are all across Canada.
So by what you're saying, there should be no lack of housing available, or...
Well, all across Canada, there should be no poor people, right? for that matter, yeah, absolutely.
I'm just gonna interrupt and say we should take a break, because it's 10 to 8, and if anybody wants coffee or anything else, we'll be closing in 10 minutes. And we will come back and finish up. I'm doing the white man thing and overriding Vince. Cut him off. Well, he's not a person anyway. Because he's a priest, he's not an Indian, obviously.